Hello again, students. So we were talking about the calamities of the 14th century, and aside from the plague being one of the worst things that ever happened to Europe up until that point, anyway, there was something else that kind of mixed with the tragedy of the plague at the same time that made life all that much harder, and it's also going to completely change the political landscape of Western Europe, anyway, which was the Hundred Years' War. So this war is kind of complicated, as all wars are, especially when they last 100 years. Um, but I kind of want to take you through some of the causes of the war, and the course of the war you don't really have to know too much about, but it is kind of interesting. So there were three long-term causes. First of all, it was a dispute over this territory in what is actually now France, called the Duchy of Gascony. A duchy is a piece of land that is ruled by a duke, which is a noble. And technically, because of lineages that had been already established at this point, the King of England was supposed to also be the Duke of Gascony in France because Gascony belonged to England. That meant that at this point, King Henry III of England was the Duke of Gascony in France. So technically, that makes him a vassal to the King of France, since dukes are vassals to kings. This was a problem for Henry, though, because since he is the King of England, he doesn't want to be a vassal to anyone. So he had a bit of a problem, when it came to bending the knee, so to speak, to the King of France. If you watch Game of Thrones, you'll understand. The other big problem, another dispute also was over who was supposed to be the next French king. And a lot of this has to do with political intrigue and drama that is very typical of medieval royal politics. So first of all, in your book, you see this name come up, and they should explain to you, but I'll tell you. Capetian dynasty or Capetian dynasty. Capet is actually the last name of the royal family of France, or one of the royal families. The Capet dynasty had ruled France for a long time. At this point, though, by the time we get to this part of history, they hadn't had any sons, which is a problem, of course, because you need a son in order to continue the dynasty. So the King of France was Philip IV, and he had a daughter, Isabella. And in order to kind of establish a sort of political alliance and relationship, he had her marry the King of England, which was Edward II. And of course, we're talking about different kings and and princes now, because this does take place over a long period of time. And Edward II and Isabella had a son, which they named Edward III. What's so special about Edward III is that he comes from two very important lineages, the throne of England and the throne of France. So he's literally like the living embodiment of the connection between the two countries. Anyway, Edward III, so for that reason, he's a pretty important guy. Isabella does not love her husband, though, Edward II. Of course, in most political arrangements, politically arranged marriages, there was very little love between the two. She did have a lover, and she and her lover conspired to overthrow her husband, which is exactly what they did. They overthrew her husband and had him killed. And because her son, at the time Edward III was still a child, she got to rule the country of England as a regent, meaning like sort of in charge until he grew old enough. That was really quite clever of her. The thing is, though, that Edward supposedly says he can claim the heredity to be both the French and the English king. And this would be weird for the English and the French, who had been sort of enemies and had been fighting over territory for so long, to all of a sudden be technically considered one nation. The French don't like this because this would technically put them under the control of the British. So they claimed that he could not inherit the throne of France. He could certainly be the King of England because of his father, but he couldn't inherit the French throne through his mother, because a female could not pass on the throne. So instead, they chose a cousin of the Capet family called Philip of Valois, and he was then named Philip VI, the King of France. So now we've got two kings, Edward III and Philip of Valois. They are cousins, but also because of their national heritage, they're also technically enemies. Okay, so an immediate cause, though, and this is going to happen in 1337. So moving forward, Edward III. Now he's all grown up. He's the king. He's now, as again, he's the Duke of Gascony. Remember, because the King of England also gets to be the Duke of Gascony, and he is feeling pretty hurt about the fact that his cousin Philip IV, Philip of Valois, has taken the throne of France from him, which he feels is rightfully his. So he refuses to pay homage or to pledge loyalty to his cousin, the King of France. And so his cousin does not take that lightly. He is insulted. And he says, fine, if you're not going to bend the knee, then I will take Gascony away from you. So he seizes the territory, in which he, of course, has the advantage there, since Gascony is technically in France, and he declares war. So that's how it all started. Also, something to know about these two men: they both really liked war. Most kings did. That was how you proved yourself as a king and as a leader, and that's also how you kept your military in shape. Was you made them actually go to war for real. And so they both wanted the glory and the power. Their nobles wanted plunder and territory that would be promised to them if they won. So how the war really went, it went in a few different phases. And it starts off first with the knights being really in charge and being very enthusiastic. But over the course of 100 years, it was really the peasants, the peasant foot soldiers, the ones who don't ride on cavalry, that would determine the outcome. And this was going to be a very chaotic and messy war that, because it was 100 years, it would actually outlive several generations. And one of the things that happens during the course of this war is the marked difference between the French and the English armies. The French are very much more, I guess you could say, interested in status, like social status. So in the French army, there was a lot of sort of bitterness and snobbery, for lack of a better word, because you have the noble cavalrymen who, they ride horses and they're of noble blood, so they're wealthy and they're often the leaders, followed by the peasant foot soldiers and the crossbowmen, who were sort of looked down on. And so there's a lot of this sort of class division within the army itself, which doesn't really make for a whole lot of, teamwork and pleasantness in the army. And there wasn't a whole lot of organization or even respect within the French army. So often when the French army attacked, they didn't really have much of a plan, and they were often conflicted with each other. The English army, however, paid its peasants to be foot soldiers, and so therefore had a little more respect for them, along with the fact that they were now using the longbow, which was from Wales. So the Welsh had introduced that to the English, and the longbows were way more powerful and were much more effective in warfare, and they weren't really as divided by elitism as the French. So clearly, it looks like the English have an advantage there, which it is. But despite that, though, it'd be really hard for an English army, with medieval tools, not tanks and airplanes of today, but with horses and arrows, to take over an entire country that is separated from them by the English Channel. So in the end, even though the English are actually have a better army, the spoiler alert here is that it's not really going to be that easy for them, practically speaking, to take a whole country. So the 100 Years' War kind of goes into these several phases. The first phase of the war, you see it looks like the English are winning, where at the Battle of Crecy, they prove how effective their weapons are when they take a massive English victory, and the French were completely disorganized and didn't know what they were doing. And then later at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, the King of France himself, Philip VI, was actually captured at that battle and taken hostage. So after the French paid a ransom, a truce was enforced, and that seemed to kind of cause a little bit of peace for about 20 years. And the only problem, though, is that peace with the Peace of Brittany, as it was called, it was not really enforced. And 20 years later, it restarted again, this time under a new generation of kings. And from England, we have Henry V, who he takes advantage of a situation in France when some dukes of France are actually at war with each other. So there's like this sort of civil war taking place in France. And he figures this is as good a time as any to attack and try to finish what we started. So he attacks again, and in this battle, he wins, and he manages to then work out a deal in which he married the daughter of his enemy, who is technically also his cousin. And there was a lot of cousin marrying going on back then. So he marries Catherine, who is Charles VI's daughter. And by marrying the Princess of France, technically that makes him the heir to the French throne, because if anything were to happen to his father-in-law, the King of France, he'd become the king. So that puts them all in a precarious position. Now Charles actually does have a son, but he's not a very good leader. Charles the Dauphin, or heir to the French throne, he was kind of weak and not really good at rallying troops. Back in those days, in order to go to war, you really got to believe in your leader, because you're going into this really bloody mess. And he just didn't have the X factor that is required of so many leaders in war. But seemingly out of nowhere, this peasant girl named Joan of Arc, about 17 years old, comes out of nowhere and says that she's been having visions from God, that God speaks to her, and that she will be the one to lead the French to victory against the English. Somehow, for whatever reason, this works, and the French troops suddenly rally behind her, and she's actually turns out to be a very effective leader out in the battlefield, probably because she gave the French troops something to really believe in. They weren't just fighting for themselves, but through Joan of Arc, they were fighting for God as well. Unfortunately for Joan, she was captured by the English, or actually by the allies of the English in 1430, and then they turned her over to the Inquisition, which was this sort of special office of the Catholic Church that tortured people into confessing their sins or converting to the church, or executed people. And she ended up being burned at the stake after she was accused of witchcraft, as was pretty usual for women who got a little bit too politically strong and claimed to have visions from God, so to speak. But overall, even though it starts off with the English being very strong, like I said before, the English are not going to be able to take an entire country as big as France using nothing but horses and arrows. It just doesn't work that way. And so even though they had a really good army, they simply don't have the resources to be able to cover a territory as big as France. So by the time the war was finally over in 1453, the French could basically say that they had won. Although after a war of 100 years where there has been so much devastation and destruction, it's kind of hard to call anyone a winner. But politically speaking, the French were able to retain their territory. But why this war was so significant is because, well, it took place in this terrible, defining century, but also because it's really going to create a lot of political instability, and it's going to also change the political landscape of Europe. First of all, governments suddenly became a lot larger, especially in France and England. A war is a good way to expand your government. That's how you have to raise taxes. You have to basically raise a military. Suddenly kings become much more powerful during war. And so the question then becomes, these government bodies are getting so big, who should control them? Should it be the nobles? Should it be the king? Should it be the church? Another thing that really starts to change is that land was no longer really deemed good enough as payment for military services. The reason is because war sort of proves that land can very easily be taken away. An invading army can come and just take away or burn down everything that you have. So something else was now necessary to kind of incline people for military service, and that was money, like actual gold. And this is going to change the way kings do business as well. Another thing that lords could do as well is they could pay their king something called scutage, which is money that you pay instead of military service. So peasants could also do this as well. If you didn't want to enlist in the military, which after seeing 100 years of war, not a whole lot of people were really rallying for it. They had grown kind of tired of it. that you could pay a certain amount of money instead of joining the military. So this was good for kings because this meant that they were making money, and since they couldn't force people into the military, and that they were accepting people's money instead, then they could hire mercenaries. Mercenaries are professional soldiers for hire, but mercenaries are actually really expensive, and even that money, that scutage that they were collecting, wasn't enough. So something that kings had to do was it meant that they would have to raise taxes. So this really leads to like this new relationship in politics based on political advantage and money, meaning whoever could get the closest to the king, whoever could kind of get his ear or get him to listen, whoever was the most influential with the king, could do certain favors for money. And or, for example, other things could be exchanged for money, if not land, because money can be exchanged in private. When you exchange land, that's very public. Everyone knows who that land belongs to. But money could be exchanged very privately. And this is going to lead to a lot of corruption. This, again, is also going to lead to nobles who will then be competing with each other, each of them trying to get closest to the king or trying to do favors for the king. Sometimes they will even gang up on the king himself if they feel that he is overly corrupt or not giving them the favors that they feel they should have. And basically, since kings couldn't always trust nobles, sometimes they would use even more mercenary armies because they figured, well, I'd rather hire a mercenary army that I'm paying rather than hire an army of a noble that may or may not like me and could turn on me at any time. So, of course, this means that they need to raise taxes in order to hire more mercenaries. But the question then, of course, becomes who has the right to raise taxes? In England and in France, there were parliamentary bodies, which were usually made up of nobles. And ever since the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215, it was established that a king couldn't just raise taxes without permission. He needed the Parliament's permission to raise the taxes. So this, ironically, also has a side effect of giving Parliament more power over the king, since now the king technically needs them. So this makes this makes politics incredibly complicated, because on the one hand, the king doesn't trust the nobles and Parliament because they could turn on him. On the other hand, he needs them because he needs their permission to raise taxes so he can raise those mercenary armies. This is going to make things very, very complex. So I'm going to stop here for a second. We're going to be talking about the powerful states of the Middle Ages, but I think I need to stop here so that this is not so long. But I want you guys to think about how these political relationships now change because of the presence of money as opposed to land, and how that actually even continues even today all over the world. Money and politics, and who gets to be sat closest to the leader, whether it be a king or a president, and what kind of political advantage that gives them.